The city of Sparta had no walls. Every other major power in the ancient Greek world fortified itself with stone, garrisoned its gates, and built its identity around the protection of its boundaries. Sparta did none of that, and the reason tells you everything about what it was to live inside that civilization. The story of ancient Sparta is not the one the movies gave you. It is stranger, harsher, and more human than any of them dared show. Stand at the edge of the Eurotas River Valley, in the southern Peloponnese sometime in the 5th century BCE. The mountains you see on every horizon are not scenic. They are functional. To the west, the Taygetos range rises to nearly 2,400 meters, a wall of limestone and pine that cuts Sparta off from the coast and from the rival city of Messenia to the west. To the east, the Parnon range creates a second natural barrier. The valley between them is broad, fertile, and green with the grain and olive trees that fed a civilization. The river itself runs cold and clear, fed by mountain snowmelt, and in winter it is fast enough to test the strength of any man who tries to cross it. Sparta did not look like a city. The Greek historian Thucydides wrote, with deliberate irony, that if Sparta were ever abandoned and only its temples and buildings remained, future generations would find it hard to believe the place had ever been as powerful as it was. He was right. There was no Parthenon here, no agora crowded with philosophers, no grand avenue lined with victory monuments. What existed instead were 5 villages strung along the valley floor: Limnae, Kynosura, Messoa, Pitana, and Amyklai, held together not by walls or civic architecture, but by a shared identity so intense that it did not require stone to express itself. The peak of Spartan power stretched roughly from 550 to 371 BCE, a span of nearly 2 centuries during which Sparta controlled more territory on the Greek mainland than any other city-state, commanded the most feared land army in the known world, and built a social order that no other civilization in recorded history has ever fully replicated. Athens had philosophy and democracy and theatre. Sparta had something else. It had a system. To understand what daily life actually looked like inside that system, you have to understand who lived inside it. Spartan society was not a single unified class. It was a pyramid, and the position you occupied in that pyramid determined every detail of your existence from the day you were born until the day you died. At the top stood the Spartiates, the full citizens, the warrior class. The ancient sources call them the homoioi, which translates as the equals or the peers. This was not a description of their wealth or status relative to each other. It was a claim about their shared submission to the same relentless standard. A Spartiate was a professional soldier, full-time, from the age of 7 until the age of 60. He did not farm, he did not trade, he did not build or craft or sell. All of that work was done by others while he trained, fought, competed, and prepared to train and fight again. Below the Spartiates lived the perioikoi, meaning those who dwell around. These were free people, neither slaves nor citizens, who occupied towns and villages throughout the Spartan territory. They paid taxes, served in the army when required, and engaged in all the commerce and craftsmanship that Spartiates were forbidden to touch. A Spartan warrior's bronze helmet was made by a perioikoi craftsman. His sandals were cobbled by perioikoi hands. His iron sword was forged by a perioikoi smith. The warrior class could not function without these people, but the system granted them no political voice and no share in the identity that made Sparta what it was. At the base of the pyramid, outnumbering everyone above them by a ratio that ancient sources estimate at roughly 7-1, were the helots. The word itself is debated in etymology, but the reality it described was not. The helots were an enslaved population, and they were not enslaved in the way that individual war captives or purchased workers were enslaved elsewhere in the ancient world. They were an enslaved nation. They were primarily the descendants of the Messenians, the people of the fertile land to the west of the Taygetos Mountains, whom Sparta had conquered in a brutal series of wars during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The Messenians had been free people with their own cities, their own culture, their own gods. Then Sparta broke them, took their land, and put them to work farming it for the benefit of a warrior class they were forbidden to challenge or resist. This is the detail that changes everything. The Spartan military machine, the agoge training system, the communal messes, the crypteia, the laws against individual wealth and private luxury, the breeding logic behind Spartan women's freedoms, all of it, every piece of it, was shaped by one overriding reality. Sparta was a minority ruling class sitting on top of a population that outnumbered it 7-1, and that had every reason in the world to burn the whole system to the ground. Now walk into the city itself. Step off the road and into the village streets. The first thing you notice is the quiet. There are no merchants calling out prices, no carts piled with imported pottery from Corinth, no perfume sellers or money changers. The trade that animated every other Greek city barely exists here. What you see instead are men. Groups of them moving with the economy of motion that comes not from laziness, but from total physical conditioning. They are lean, not in the way of hunger, but in the way of relentless use. They move like people for whom the body is a tool, and inefficiency is a form of failure. The homes lining these streets are not what you would find in Athens. An Athenian house of this period might have plastered walls painted in ochre or terracotta, a courtyard garden, a room set aside for women's work, fine clay vessels imported from workshops across the Aegean. A Spartan home has none of that. The walls are rough stone or timber, the floors are packed earth, the furnishings are minimal, a sleeping pallet, a few wooden chests, clay lamps, ceramic vessels for water and oil. Nothing decorative, nothing that exists for beauty rather than function. Plutarch, writing centuries later, but drawing on older sources, records that Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver who supposedly created the Spartan system, restricted the tools allowed in home construction to the axe and the saw. The precise historical truth of this is uncertain, but the principle it captures is accurate. Display was a form of weakness in Sparta. A man who needed a beautiful house was advertising that he lacked something. The Spartan did not lack. The Spartan was sufficient. Here is the detail that flips the whole picture of domestic life. The adult Spartan male citizen did not live with his family. He lived with his military unit, his Sicilian, his communal mess, until the age of 30. He could marry, and many men did marry young, but after the wedding he returned to the barracks. He visited his wife at night, in secret, as if it were a raid. He ate his meals not at home but with his 15 or so mess companions. He slept in the barracks. He trained with the group. He was, in every practical sense, a permanent member of a military commune, and the home he returned to was a place of rest, not life. The Syssitia, the communal military messes, were the structural backbone of adult Spartan male existence. Every full citizen belonged to one. Membership was not voluntary. A Spartan who could not meet his monthly food contribution to the mess lost his citizenship. The contribution was fixed, roughly 70 kilograms of barley, 36 liters of wine, 5 kilograms of cheese, and 2.5 kilograms of figs each month. This was not a banquet requirement, it was a minimum standard, a civic obligation embedded in the act of eating. And what they ate at those messes was not refined. The most famous dish in Spartan cuisine was the melazomos, the black broth, a thick stew of pork boiled with its blood, salt and vinegar. Ancient sources record that when a king from Pontus on the Black Sea tasted this broth and found it repellent, a Spartan cook told him that the dish only tasted right after bathing in the Eurotas River, meaning that only a man who had lived the Spartan life could appreciate what the Spartan ate. This is probably a story invented to make a point, but the point is accurate. The black broth was not designed to be pleasant. It was designed to sustain a body that worked hard and needed fuel rather than pleasure. The mess was also where the real social education of Spartan manhood took place. Boys who had completed the agoge joined messes where older men tested them, questioned them, pushed them. The conversations at the Spartan table were not casual. Young men were expected to speak concisely, answer directly, and demonstrate the quality of mind that matched the quality of body the agoge had produced. The Spartan reputation for brevity in speech, what we now call laconic wit after the region of Laconia, was cultivated deliberately at these tables. If a man needed many words, he was not in control of his thoughts. Step back now and look at the women. This is where the gap between the Spartan reality and every other Greek city-state becomes most stark. In Athens, the ideal woman was largely invisible. She managed the household, supervised slaves, spun wool, raised children, and appeared in public only under specific circumstances and always with a male escort. Her name was rarely spoken in polite company. She had no legal standing to own property, initiate contracts, or participate in civic life. She was, in the Athenian view, a domestic creature, confined by design. Spartan women went outside. They exercised in public, running and wrestling alongside each other in competitions that ancient Greek visitors found astonishing and sometimes scandalous. A Spartan girl received physical education as a matter of course. She was trained in running, throwing the discus, hurling the javelin, and engaging in combat sports. She ate enough food to build and maintain physical condition. She was taught to read. She was encouraged to speak her mind. And here is where you have to be careful about what you call this. It was not feminism in the modern sense. It was not liberation conceived out of a principle of human equality. Spartan women's freedoms were engineered for a specific purpose, and the ancient Spartans were explicit about what that purpose was. A physically strong woman produced physically strong children. A woman who managed the household estates competently, while her husband trained and fought, kept the economy of the warrior class functioning. A woman who was ideologically committed to the state's values raised sons who would not flinch at the agoge, and daughters who would not weep when their sons left for war. The Spartan mother who said to her son, as he departed for battle, "Return with your shield or on it," was not performing bravery for an audience. She was expressing the core value the state had placed inside her. A soldier who threw away his heavy shield was one who had chosen his own survival over his unit's formation. The shield was the collective weapon. Dropping it was cowardice. The Spartan mother had been taught since girlhood that cowardice was worse than death, and she taught it in turn to her children. The state had turned the family into an extension of the military apparatus. Now move to the place where that apparatus was built from the beginning. Every Spartan boy who survived infancy entered the agoge at the age of 7. The word agoge translates roughly as upbringing or leading, but neither of those captures what it actually was. The agoge was total institutional possession of a child by the state. From the moment a boy entered it, his primary loyalty was no longer to his family, it was to his group of peers, to his training officers, and through them to Sparta itself. The process began with the physical examination that took place at birth. Ancient sources, primarily Plutarch, describe a practice in which newborn Spartan boys were brought before a group of elders from the child's tribe who examined the infant for physical fitness. If the child appeared weak or deformed, it was reportedly left at a place called the Apothetai, a ravine or pit at the foot of Mount Taygetos. The historical reality of this practice is debated. Some scholars argue it was systematic state policy, others that it was more localized and less common than ancient accounts suggest, and that many exposed infants were retrieved by perioikoi families. What is not debated is the principle the practice embodies. In Sparta, the state's claim on a life began before that life could speak or walk. The boy who passed and survived to age 7 was then removed from his home. He joined a group of peers called an illa, a unit of boys roughly his own age, supervised by a senior youth called an aren, who had himself just passed through the final stage of the agoge. These groups lived together, trained together, ate together, competed against each other, and would eventually fight together. The bonding between mess companions that structured adult Spartan male life began here. In the dormitories where boys slept on reed beds they had cut themselves from the banks of the Eurotas River. The deliberately uncomfortable conditions were not incidental. They were designed. Boys were given insufficient food so that they would learn to steal. They were then punished, but not for stealing. If you were caught, you were punished for the failure of detection. The lesson was not that theft was wrong. The lesson was that survival required intelligence, stealth, and the willingness to take what you needed when the situation demanded it. The skills being trained in that dormitory were precisely the skills a soldier on campaign, cut off from supply lines in hostile territory, would need to survive. The boys wore a single thin cloak year-round. In winter this meant shivering through cold nights on a reed bed. They were expected to endure without complaint. Complaints were a form of weakness, and weakness in the Agoj was not merely a personal failure, it was a social failure, an embarrassment to the group, a threat to the collective standard. The other boys in the aisle would be watching, and the culture of peer surveillance and peer pressure was as powerful as any formal punishment. Most reconstructions of Spartan training focus on the physical, the running, the wrestling, the weapons practice. But the Agoj was also an education in the Spartan social code, in the compressed, ironic, unflinching style of speech that Sparta expected of its men. Boys were questioned at the table by the Arenes. They were challenged to respond quickly and well. A fumbling, overlong answer was met with ridicule. A sharp, direct answer earned respect. The boys who excelled at this became the informal leaders of their aisle, and their leadership was not given by authority, but by demonstrated quality, which meant the competition to demonstrate quality was constant. Formal educational content in the modern sense, reading, mathematics, philosophy, was minimal. Spartan training did not aim to produce scholars. It aimed to produce men who could endure, decide quickly, fight effectively, and die without disgracing their unit. The musical education that did exist, Spartan boys learned to play the olos, a double pipe instrument, and to sing martial songs, served military function. Battle hymns kept soldiers in step. The Spartans marched to war not to the beat of drums, but to the melody of pipes, and a soldier who could hold a tune under pressure was a soldier who could hold a formation. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, one of Sparta's most important religious sites, young men competed in an endurance rite that ancient sources describe in detail. The ritual involved standing before the altar while other participants struck the competitor with rods or whips, with the goal of stealing cheeses from the altar while absorbing this punishment. The competitor who endured the longest without crying out won. Some ancient accounts claim competitors died from this rite. Whether the practice was as extreme as described in its earliest form, or whether it evolved into a more theatrical spectacle over time, as some later Roman accounts suggest, the ritual's purpose was clear. It established pain tolerance as a public, measurable, testable virtue. In Sparta, suffering was not a private experience. It was a performance, judged by an audience. The Arene, the senior youth who supervised the Agoj groups, was himself a product of the same system. He had authority over the boys in his charge, and that authority included the power to administer punishment. But the Iron was also being tested. If his group performed poorly, he bore responsibility. If a boy under his supervision behaved dishonorably, the Iron answered for it. The chain of accountability ran through every layer of the system. At the age of 20, a Spartan youth who had survived the Agoj and been voted into a mess by its members achieved a first stage of citizenship. He could now serve in the army as a full soldier, but he did not leave the barracks. He continued living communally, continuing to eat in the Sicyon, continuing to train, until he reached the age of 30, at which point he achieved full Spartiate status, could attend the Appella, the Spartan Citizens' Assembly, could vote, and could participate in the governance of the state. These are the mechanics. But the mechanics only explain what happened. They do not explain what it felt like. Here is what almost no historical reconstruction emphasizes. The Spartan social system worked primarily through shame, not through physical punishment alone, though punishment existed, not through legal enforcement alone, though law existed. It worked because the values it instilled were so deeply embedded in every Spartan from childhood that deviation from those values felt not like rule-breaking, but like self-destruction. A Spartan did not avoid cowardice because the law forbade it. He avoided it because cowardice was, to him, a form of death more complete than any battle could provide. The Spartan word for a man who had failed militarily, who had retreated without orders or shown cowardice in the face of the enemy, was tresantes, the tremblers. This word followed a man for the rest of his life. He was stripped of citizenship. He was forbidden to hold public office. He was excluded from the gymnasia where citizens exercised. He was barred from the games. He was excluded from the mess. He was required to wear clothing that identified him as a coward in public. Any citizen who encountered him in the street was permitted to strike him without legal consequence. His family shared the disgrace. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, 2 Spartan soldiers who survived the last stand were later identified as tresantes, one because he had been sent away from the pass on a medical mission before the final engagement, and one because he had been ill. Neither of them had retreated. Both of them suffered the social death that came with being known as survivors of a battle where everyone else had died. One of them, a man named Pantites, reportedly hanged himself when he returned home and found what awaited him. The other, Aristodemus, redeemed himself at the Battle of Plataea the following year by fighting with such reckless aggression that he was killed. But the Spartans, according to Herodotus, refused to honor him with the prize for valor, because his bravery had been the bravery of a man seeking death, rather than the measured courage of a man fighting to win. Now step outside the social logic of the warrior class and look at the system that made it possible. The helots worked. Every day, in every season, in every condition, the helots worked. They plowed the kleros, the land allotments that each Spartan citizen held, but was forbidden by custom to work himself. They harvested the grain, pressed the olives, tended the livestock, produced the surplus that the Spartan citizen contributed to his mess each month, and kept the households of Spartan women functioning while the men trained. Without the helots, there was no Sparta. The warrior class existed in a state of total economic dependency on the people it refused to recognize as fully human. The helot contribution to each kleros was fixed. Ancient sources report that each helot family delivered a set quantity of grain and other produce to their Spartiate master each year, and that anything above that amount belonged to the helot family. This was not generosity. It was a management strategy. If helots could accumulate some surplus above their quota, they had a marginally greater incentive to maintain productivity. It was, in the coldest possible sense, an incentive structure designed to extract maximum output with minimum resistance. But here is what that number does not tell you. The helot population of Laconia and Messenia, by the most conservative ancient estimates, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Spartiate citizen class at its peak, in the early 5th century BCE, may have numbered around 8,000 fighting men. Within a generation, after battlefield losses and the rigid requirements of the agoge, that number began to shrink. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the number of Spartan citizens capable of fighting may have fallen below 1,000. The system that was supposed to produce warriors was, through its own relentless attrition, consuming the warriors it produced. The helots knew their history. They knew that their ancestors had been Messenians, free people with their own identity, their own kings, their own sacred sites. The memory of that loss was not abstract. It was transmitted through families, through the music and songs that helots were permitted to sing among themselves, through the landscape itself, which still contained the ruins of Messenian cities and the shrines of Messenian heroes that Sparta had not entirely erased. And Sparta knew what that memory meant. The annual declaration of war against the Helots is one of the most extraordinary institutional facts in ancient Greek history. Each year, the ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who held supreme executive authority in Sparta, formally declared a state of war between Sparta and the Helots. This was not a metaphor. It was a legal instrument. Under Greek religious and legal custom, killing a person in peacetime required ritual purification and could carry social or legal consequences. By declaring the Helots perpetual enemies of the state, Sparta created a legal framework in which killing a Helot required no justification beyond the fact that he existed. Under this framework operated the Crypteia. The word translates roughly as the secret thing or the hidden institution. Each year, the most capable young men nearing the end of their agoge training were selected for it. They were sent out into the countryside at night, armed with short daggers and carrying minimal provisions, with orders to survive by their own means and to kill any Helot who appeared physically formidable, assertive, or potentially dangerous. The Crypteia was simultaneously a graduation exercise in survival skills and a systematic instrument of political terror. Aristotle criticized it in his Politics, describing it as one of the elements that made the Spartan system brutish rather than truly excellent. He was not wrong. The Crypteia was not incidental to Sparta's character. It was central to it. The warrior class that prided itself on fighting in the open, in formation, by the rules of Greek warfare, also maintained a secret institution whose entire purpose was to hunt and kill unarmed people in the dark. The psychological weight of this on the Helot population can only be imagined. Every adult Helot man knew that he was potentially the target of young men with daggers who had been authorized by the state to kill him. Displaying too much physical strength, too much confidence, too much independence was a survival risk. The Crypteia was designed to select for exactly the qualities that might make a Helot leader and to eliminate them before they could become threats. There were Helot uprisings anyway. The memory and the resentment ran too deep for any system of terror to entirely suppress them. The most significant revolt in the classical period came in the aftermath of a catastrophic earthquake in 464 BCE that destroyed much of Sparta's physical infrastructure and killed a substantial number of Spartiate citizens. The Helots of Messenia and some of the Perioikoi of the Laconian coast rose in rebellion and established a fortified position at Mount Ithome in the heart of old Messenian territory. It took Sparta a decade of siege warfare to reduce that fortress, and the final settlement required allowing the rebels to leave in safety under a religious truce, an outcome that revealed how far the city's capacity to simply crush resistance had been degraded by the earthquake and its aftermath. After that revolt, the Spartan fear of Helot uprising intensified rather than diminished. The Crypteia continued. The annual declaration of war continued. The Spartans reportedly required their Helots to perform rituals of humiliation at certain festivals, including being forced to drink unmixed wine in public, a practice associated in the Greek world with loss of control and barbarian behavior, as a performative enactment of the social distance between master and slave. This was not cruelty for its own sake, though it was certainly cruelty. It was policy. It was a regular, institutionalized reminder of who held power and who did not. Now stand in the precinct of Artemis Orthia and think about what the Spartans asked their gods for. Religion in Sparta was not separate from the military system. It was woven through every layer of it. The great goddess Artemis Orthia presided over the rites of passage through which Spartan boys became men. Apollo, the god of light, order, music, and prophecy, was Sparta's primary divine patron, and his oracle at Delphi held a level of authority over Spartan decision-making that has no modern equivalent. Before any major military campaign, before any significant political decision, Spartan kings and magistrates consulted the Delphic oracle. If the omens were negative, campaigns were delayed, battles were postponed. The religious calendar held power over the military calendar, which meant that the god, or more precisely the priests who interpreted the god, could stop an army in its tracks. The Gymnopedia, was one of Sparta's great civic festivals, a multi-day celebration involving naked athletic competition, choral singing, and public ritual. The word itself means Naked Boys' Festival, and it was held annually in the blazing heat of midsummer. The participants, organized in age groups including adult men, performed complex choral dances and competed in wrestling and running while exposed to the full force of the summer sun. This was not recreation. It was public demonstration of physical conditioning, of the capacity for sustained effort under discomfort, of collective discipline performed before an audience that included the entire community. The religious festival was also a fitness inspection. The Hyacinthia, held in honor of the hero Hyacinthus, whom legend said had been accidentally killed by Apollo and mourned before being honored, was a 3-day festival that began with lament and ended with celebration, with athletic games, musical performances, and feasting. The structure of mourning followed by athletic triumph was not incidental. It was a template for how Spartans were expected to process loss, quickly, fully, and then moving past it into demonstrated excellence. The gods watched, and the gods approved. That was the message of every festival, every sacrifice, every consultation of the oracle. The Spartan way was not merely a human political arrangement, it was a divinely sanctioned order, and the divine sanction made it, for those inside the system, essentially unquestionable. But let us question it anyway, because the evidence rewards that questioning. Sparta's population numbers tell a story the warrior mythology obscures. In the early 5th century BCE, at the height of Spartan power, the city could field perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 Spartiate hoplites. By the time of Leuctra in 371 BCE, roughly a century later, that number had shrunk to perhaps 700 men capable of serving. The rate of decline was catastrophic, and the causes were multiple. Battlefield deaths removed men who had no male heirs. The agoge's severity may have suppressed fertility by keeping men out of their households for the critical years of early marriage. The financial requirements of mess membership drove some Spartiates into the lower status of hypomeones, inferiors, when they could no longer meet their monthly contributions. The system that was supposed to maintain an elite warrior class was consuming itself. Sparta responded to this demographic crisis not by relaxing the system, but by doubling down on it, and by relying more heavily on Helot auxiliary soldiers and allied troops from elsewhere. In the final major campaigns of the late classical period, armies that called themselves Spartan contained only a tiny nucleus of actual Spartiates, surrounded by non-citizens fighting under Spartan command. The armor was still Spartan, the tactics were still Spartan, but the men were not. Epaminondas of Thebes ended the myth at Leuctra in 371 BCE. The Theban general deployed his sacred band, a unit of 300 elite soldiers, in a deep column on the left wing of his line, opposite the strongest point of the Spartan formation, which by convention was always anchored on the right by the best troops. The depth of the Theban column created a concentrated mass that punched through the Spartan right, killing the commanding king Cleombrotus and shattering a force that had never been broken in open battle in living memory. Roughly 400 Spartiates died at Leuctra. Given that there were only about 1,000 left in total, this was not a military defeat. It was an existential wound. The city that Thucydides said would leave no ruins, impressive enough to suggest its power left exactly that. A valley, some village foundations, the remains of a modest theatre, a few column fragments from the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. The things Sparta built to last were not made of stone. Walk back through this civilization one more time with everything you now know. The boy of 7, entering the agoge, did not know he was entering a system designed primarily to solve a demographic and security problem. He knew that this was what it meant to be a Spartan, that the values being hammered into him were real and worth the cost, that the friends sleeping beside him on reed beds in the barracks were the people who would one day stand beside him in a battle line where each man's survival depended on the man next to him holding his position. That bond was real. The courage it produced was real. The discipline that allowed 300 men at Thermopylae to hold a mountain pass against a Persian army for 3 days, fighting until the last one of them was dead, was real. But the helot working the kleros before dawn, carrying the harvest that fed the warrior, knew a different truth. He knew that his children were not citizens and never would be. He knew that the young man who walked past his field at night with a dagger had the legal right to kill him. He knew that the civilization that called its warriors the equals had decided, before he was born, that he and his family were not equal to anything at all. To see Sparta clearly is to hold both of these truths at the same time, without discarding either one for the convenience of a simpler story. The discipline was extraordinary, the cost was extraordinary, the achievement was real, the cruelty was real, and the civilization that sustained itself for nearly 2 centuries on that combination of excellence and terror eventually produced exactly what every system built on the suppression of human potential eventually produces: a structure too brittle to absorb the shock of a single decisive loss. Sparta had no walls because it believed it needed none, but walls are not just protection against enemies outside, they are a statement about what you value inside. The thing Sparta was most afraid of lived inside its own borders, outnumbered the warrior class 7-1, and worked the fields that fed the men who claimed to be the walls. When you read the story of Leonidas at the Hot Gates, or the Spartan mother sending her son to war, or the boy enduring the flogging at the altar of Artemis, remember that somewhere just beyond the frame of every one of those stories, a helot was working in a field, feeding a system that had decided his life was the price of someone else's glory. What does that tell us about the cost of greatness? And more importantly, whose cost was it?